I wanted to comment on what's happening in Algeria at the moment from two perspectives. There has been a lot of interest from international media and from many observers, whether in the US or in Europe, in the mass demonstrations that took place in Algeria in February and now in March 2019 to protest against a fifth term for President Bouteflika in Algeria. And I think it's probably worth reflecting on a few questions on that situation. The first is why? Why has been this very strong interest in Algeria's demonstrations, while there has been by far less interest in other demonstrations in other countries of the Arab world? Sudan, for example, has been witnessing quite significant demonstrations for a few weeks now, but hardly actually they got the front page news status that the demonstrations in Algeria received. So why Algeria has triggered such a strong interest? I think for a number of reasons that observers need to keep in mind. Number one, because of the recent history. Algeria in the 1990s went through a whole decade of an internal war, a civil war, between two huge camps. On one side, the regime that has ruled Algeria since the 1960s, since the end of the French presence in Algeria, that regime on one side, and on the other side, different groups of Islamist backgrounds and orientations, and together they entered into this vicious, decade-long civil war that exacted over 150,000 lives and left tens of thousands of people misplaced and unaccounted for. So that history of colossal human loss in such a country is in the minds of the observers of the Arab world. And it is very important to keep that recent history in mind when people are looking at the country today. The second reason behind the interest in Algeria is that it is a very strategically important country. It's Africa's biggest country by land mass. It's a key player in the war against militancy in Western Africa. Algeria played different, subtle, but very important roles actually in Libya, and especially in stemming the threat of militancy coming out of Libya to its neighborhood. Algeria have had a very tense relationship with Morocco for decades now, relating to the Western Sahara issue. Algeria is the third largest exporter of gas to Europe. And it has, by many standards, a very strong and efficient military. So, in a nutshell, any turbulence, any serious chaos that could potentially take place or happen in Algeria will reverberate wide and far from Algeria. That is a key reason why the world is paying a close attention to what's happening in that country. There's also a point that observers need to keep in mind. Algeria is very rich. It's rich as a country. It's, as I said, it's one of the largest producers of oil and gas in Africa, the third largest exporter of gas to Europe. And also keep in mind that all of this oil and gas wealth is there despite a very low investment into that industry for decades. So imagine the potential of the country in oil and gas if there is by far better and more modern management and investment in the industry. But Algeria also is rich in terms of a number of people who benefited a lot of that industry in the last decades, and a lot of that wealth has basically been channeled to the world and mainly to Europe. And that basically buys access, buys influence in important capitals. So in addition to the strategic reasons of why Algeria is important, you have to keep in mind the fact, basically, that the country is rich and that there are people who are inside the country or outside the country but has huge influence, are themselves rich and therefore are very influential. Even in Europe, basically. That builds interest as well. There's also a historical dimension or reason behind this strong interest in Algeria. Many people think of the Arab Spring, of the Arab uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt in 2011, basically, and think of this as the first mass revolt against ruling regimes in the last 30, 40 years. And that is not true, because in Algeria in 1988, mass demonstrations by the people and also by very young Algerians at the time against the regime at the time really set in motion measures of liberalization in the regime, which led to an election which in 1991-92 led to the winning of the Islamist groups at the time, or some of the Islamist groups at the time, which started the cycle of violence when the regime at the time annulled the election results, and it was by far more complicated than the simplification I'm putting right now. But the point I want to say is, in 1988, you had a wave of demonstrations, you had the first really significant wave of revolt in the Arab world against a ruling regime for decades, and that experience led to the civil war in the 1990s. And many people, many observers were questioning whether at one point in time Algeria will attempt another overhauling, another change of its ruling structure. So if you are thinking strategically about the Arab world, if you're thinking historically about the Arab world, modern Arab world basically, the experience of democratization or lack thereof in Algeria is very important, especially because it started in 1988 rather than in 2011 as in other countries. Another important point to keep in mind if you are following what's happening in Algeria today is, when I say the ruling establishment or the regime, what does that mean? You will find many Algerians condense all of that into one word, le pouvoir, the power, le pouvoir. And it's quite vague and intentionally vague. What is this le pouvoir? What is this power? And you find many people saying, well, it's the elite of the security apparatus. Some people will say it's basically the military. Some people will say it's the ruling groups inside the biggest party that has governed the country for so many decades. Some people will tell you it's a number of businessmen who made loads of money in the last 20 years and have become enmeshed with the political power. And all of that is true. But I think it's important to keep in mind something more specific, that Algeria has had an evolution of its ruling structure. There has been a change, an evolution in this le pouvoir. And this evolution diluted really, or reduced really, the number of people, the arms of this le pouvoir. So if in the 1990s or the early 2000s we could have said that this power, this le pouvoir, comprises a large number of groups, today, in early 2019, it's actually much smaller, because there have been an evolution whereby there has been a condensing of that power into by far less number of hands in all of these previous arms. So today, decision-making in Algeria within this le pouvoir structure is actually in the hands of by far less number of people, by far smaller number of people than it was 15 years ago or 20 years ago. The third point, which is important to bear in mind to understand or to reflect at least on what's happening in Algeria today, is President Bouteflika really in power versus this le pouvoir? Is he at the top of le pouvoir? Is he part of it? And I think the important point to keep in mind is not just that President Bouteflika has suffered a stroke in 4 or 5 years ago and has not uttered a word in public since then, and there have been many rumors about his health. This is not really the crucial point at this stage. The question is why? Why the powers that be in this le pouvoir, why are they in the shadow? Why they are not really at the front of the regime? And you'll find many political economists who give you some theories about why this is a traditional aspect of certain types of regimes and what have you. And we can theorize a lot. But I think there are 2 points that are important here. One is that in Algeria, as in other Arab countries, there has been basically a failure to evolve the basis of legitimacy. The basis of legitimacy was the revolutionary legitimacy, the revolutionary political basis that was established in the mid and late 1960s to end the French occupation of the country, to establish independence, and to create the first Algerian republic. But since then, over the past 45 years or more, there wasn't the evolution, the natural evolution of this political legitimacy into something else. It's not a unique case in Algeria, actually. It's very common in the Arab world that we've had this fossilization, this remaining within one status quo that cannot and is not able to, let alone willing to, evolve. But the result of that if you have one political legitimacy that is static, that could not move with the events, could not move with the society, then you need to stick to something in it. Otherwise, you have no legitimacy whatsoever. And the only figure who remained alive, who has been there in the political scene to represent this old revolutionary legitimacy is President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Hence, the need of these different arms and these figures within le pouvoir of retaining him for the past few years. This is a very important point about why you have forces in the shadows and why you have figures at the front. It is this legitimacy issue. Even if people saying, but that legitimacy is now obsolete, or that legitimacy is now really old, or that legitimacy should have evolved into something different. But if it is the only thing because you could not evolve something different, if you are unable or unwilling to evolve something different, then you stick with what you have, hoping or aiming to impose it as an almost sacred legitimacy that could not be touched. This is a key point in why there was the insistence on retaining President Bouteflika in the last few years. There is another reason, of course, which is to evolve the regime, to have a new legitimacy based on a different generation taking power. The different people within the pouvoir, the smaller number of people who now control decision-making within the power structure, should have arrived at some sort of a consensus or agreement on one figure who will take the helm. It is very clear that at least up to the beginning of 2019, there wasn't that consensus. There wasn't the decision to arrive at that one person who can represent the new generation within le pouvoir. And this leads us to probably another very important question, which is, so what will happen today in the first week of March 2019? The situation remains up in the air, hanging, and probably many observers in Algeria are speculating about what the future will hold. But irrespective, really, of what will happen immediately in March or in April, what will be the outcome of the elections, if there will be an elections anytime soon, to my mind, the more important question is about the future, or the two important questions about the future really boil down to two things. One is that this era in which the ruling structure had to maintain the revolutionary legitimacy based on the presence of the generation that fought in the revolution of 1960s, in the war of liberation of the 1960s. This front, this facade that needed to be maintained, that story is over. The demonstrations that have been taking place in Algeria, if in my mind they have one success, it is that it has, or these demonstrations have forced the political structure in the country to evolve, to represent itself really by its own people, by its own generation, people who are today perhaps in their 50s and 60s, and not by people who are in their 80s, who represent a different age and were just maintained there as a facade to cling to an older revolutionary or liberation legitimacy. Today, that era, that form of thinking and of political legitimacy has ended in Algeria, and there will be a new legitimacy coming to represent what has already been in power in Algeria in the last decade or so. The second question about the future is about who will be that representation, who will be that new president. And of course, there is an election. At one point in time, there will be an election that will lead to that person. But if you're thinking from a political economy point of view, in terms of where the different arms of this le pouvoir would try to influence, would try to support at least, I think here there is a wealth actually in Algeria of people who are able to take the helm, who are able to represent Algeria in a number of forums, number of fora, from which actually it has been missing for many years, and a number of people who will be able to really add value in terms of the thinking about the economy and the need to open up and effect reforms, about the political legitimacy I was talking about, without in any way trying to rock the boat, without in any way trying to have any major changes that could destabilize the country. This is one of the very good things about Algeria actually, that there is already within the ruling structure or around it a number of people who could play this role and could do it actually quite well. I'm optimistic about the future of Algeria, not just because of that wealth dimension, wealth of human capital who could do this transition role, but in addition to that, because of other factors. It is true that oil and gas dominate the Algerian economy. It's about 35% of GDP. It's at least 75% of state revenues and what have you. But Algeria is a 40 million people society. It's very well educated society actually. It has many links to different European markets, whether France or otherwise. There is already a large number of media, and actually relatively openness, especially to Francophonish culture. There is a wealth of ideas as well, and that's the point I'm trying to say. And potentially diversity, not just in the economy, but in the economy and in the society, that could propel this country forward if it economically and, of course, politically open up to the world. There's also another reason which I think is very helpful to Algeria, and that is Algeria has leverage. Algeria is, because it is such a rich country from oil and gas, it's a big market, 40 million people, because of the role it played in fighting militancy in Western Africa, and because it has been so close politically and economically, it can present itself to international stakeholders as it needs a prize. It needs not just a prize, it needs incentives for opening up, for integration with the world economy. And I think this is one of the reasons why it is such a strategically important country. I think that there will be a strong interest in many international players in important countries, whether in the West or in the East, to engage with Algeria, to try to help. Of course, because they have interests and because they would find many potential opportunities in the potential opening up of Algeria. The summary of that point is Algeria could actually extract a lot of benefits for itself if it decides to do this positive transition. And finally, it might sound strange or negative, but I think it is a great positive that the memory of the decade-long civil war in the 1990s remains fresh in the Algerian mind, even if 60% or so of the 40 million people are very young, in their teens or 20s. Still, the memory is fresh in the societal mindset, and that is a break against any descent into turbulence. Because if your society went through such a horrific experience only 20 years ago or 25 years ago, such an experience is so vivid in people's minds, in the common consciousness of the society, that it will be a break on potential chaos or potential disturbance in the country. So to close this podcast or this video, I actually think that observers of Algeria need to keep in mind that this country is not just like any other country that witnessed some mass protests and the media is paying some attention to. It is a very important, strategically important country in that part of the world, and it is a country that, despite the trauma it went through in the 90s and despite this long status quo it has been suffering from for many years now, I am very optimistic about its future because of the inherent wealth and value it has for itself and potentially could open to the world.